Hi, this is David Yack, and in this module we're going to talk about tailoring the Power Platform for your specific business requirements. This is the second module in a three-part video series. In the first module, we did an overview of the Power Platform and the components that make up the platform. If you are just joining us now, you might want to consider going back and reviewing the overview video before continuing on to this module. And then after this module, join us for the third and final module on extending. This is where we dive deeper into some of the traditional development ways that you can extend the Power Platform and unblock complex requirements. Before we get too far into the content of this module, I want to take a second to overview what I plan to cover as part of this module. We're going to start by talking about solutions. Solutions is a fundamental concept to understand with the Power Platform because it allows you to track all the customizations that you make, the apps you create, the flows you create, and be able to transport those from dev, test to production. So it's a fundamental key part of the application lifecycle management of the platform. The next topic we'll cover is data modeling. In this topic, we'll look at how you can use the Common Data Service to store application data. We'll look at how to take real-world concepts, things like people, places, other things that you track in your application, and model those with data relationships in the CDS database. Next, we'll cover building applications. This is probably one of the more exciting topics that we'll cover in this module because it really brings things to life for the user. This is what they interact with on a day-to-day basis. We'll cover the types of applications you can build. We'll look at some of the app features. In fact, I'll go build a couple apps and show you how you can go about doing that. And also we'll finish the topic discussing a little bit of what's on the roadmap for PowerApps. In the next topic, after we cover building apps, we'll move on to automating things, and we'll dive deeper into using Microsoft Flow to automate things in your solution. Our final topic we'll cover in this module is around Application Lifecycle Management, or ALM. We'll come back where we started at the beginning of this module talking about solutions, and we'll build on that discussion with a little bit more look at how we move things from dev, test to production, including how we can use Azure DevOps to automate some of that process. Let's go ahead and jump in and get started with our topics. Before we dive in and talk about solutions, there's one other topic I wanted to make sure to cover first to give you some fundamental understanding of how the Power Platform works in an Azure Active Directory tenant. So when you sign up for a Power Platform license, any of the SKUs, that all exists in an Azure Active Directory tenant. So that is kind of the bounding box that you can see in my diagram that Contoso has. Within that, you have one or more environments. Every organization has a default environment. Think about this default environment as kind of being where you build things for personal productivity. So if you build a flow, you build a Canvas app, and you're just going to use it yourself, that's where you would put it as in the default environment. If you're going to build something that's more production oriented or something used by everybody in the company, you might want to consider having a little bit more of a life cycle around that. You might have multiple environments. In that example, you might have a development environment that essentially tracks where you build the application, a test one that you go about testing the application, and a production one where users actually run the application from. Now, environments are simply containers that administrators can use to manage the apps, the flows, the connections, and other assets that you build, along with giving permissions to users to use those resources. If you have Common Data Service involved in your solution, each environment can have a single Common Data Service associated with that environment. So if you had 3 environments, you would have 3 Common Data Service instances if that was how you wanted to configure things, and each would have their own metadata associated with that. And as we talk about solutions will be created in the context of an environment and will be used to be a container to reference a particular set of resources, apps, flows, and so forth that make up your solution that will move from one environment to the next. So with that understanding of environments, let's talk about how solutions define a container to basically track the customizations you make. So when you go and create an app, a flow, you have the option of creating that within the context of a solution. One of the things I do when I start a new project, let's say I was going to go ahead and track permits that we issue for changes that people want to make to a building, and we want to do inspections on that. That's the scenario I'll use in some of the demos that I'll do as we go through this module. Now, when I started that project, what I would probably do is go and create a new environment that would be my dev environment. I would then create a solution that I would track all the apps, flows, CDS customizations that I make. So if I create an entity to track permits, I would create that in the context of the solution, and that would be what I use to basically move that from one environment to the next. So in addition to my development environment, when I got ready to release this, I would create a test environment, a production environment. That would allow users to go in and test what I built, not contaminated with any of the other development things I might have in progress, and that once that test was successful, then that same solution would be deployed to production. Now, to support that, solutions support the concept of importing and exporting. So from my development environment, I would export the solution. I would then import that into my test environment to be able to do that. Now, it's important to know it's not just the applications that you build that can be installed through solutions. This is also how Microsoft installs any of the Dynamics 365 apps that you license into your environments. These are just solutions that get installed. In fact, some of the applications can have multiple solutions that make up the complete app. And as we get a little further in the module, I'll explain how multiple solutions can be installed in one environment to make up the overall application suite that the user interacts with on a regular basis. The same is true if you go to AppSource and install any of the third-party apps built by independent software vendor, ISVs. These are also installed using solutions. Solutions allow you to install in an environment and also uninstall. That makes it perfect for trying out an application in an environment. There are two types of solutions, unmanaged and managed. When you create a new solution, it starts out as unmanaged. Unmanaged solutions are used during development. They are modifiable directly, so you can make changes to it, add components, remove components. And this is what you export if you want to move it to another development environment. Solutions can become managed when you export them from an environment that has the unmanaged solution. When you are ready to move your application from dev to test to production, that is when you would export the solution and choose the managed option when you export the solution. That gives you a solution file that you can import into the test environment or the production environment, and it's no longer directly changeable. It's meant for distribution to the non-development environments. In an environment, you can install multiple solutions. Every environment starts with the CDM, Common Data Model, system entities already pre-installed in that environment. You can go ahead and install other solutions in, and they can all coexist together. And in fact, the applications that you build can build on each other using layering of solutions. And what the user sees is the combination of all those solutions. So let's take a healthcare example where I've installed in the environment some Common Data Model healthcare extensions that were put out as an accelerator by Microsoft. That would have things like patient, care team, other common healthcare entities that might exist. Contoso, who's the organization that's building the solution, might have some other things that they want to add. They may want to add some attributes to the patient entity, or add other custom entities that are part of their common solutions that multiple applications might take advantage. Those could be packaged up in a solution and imported into an environment. Now, what the user sees, or if you build apps in this environment, is the combination of all of these solutions that have been pre-installed. So if I was going to build a device inventory app or a kudos app for my employees to thank people for good care that they gave to patients, those would see all the entities and attributes combined together that any of the solutions in that environment. So from Contoso Common, healthcare extension, as well as what comes out of the box with the CDM system entities. Most things built on the Power Platform don't get built once, deployed, and then never changed again. Probably one of the most productive ways that you can take advantage of the Power Platform is to take advantage of its iterative ability to build solutions, not have to boil the ocean all at once. By that, we might get our application to what might be considered the first minimum viable product that we could release to users to actually give some feedback on. They might use that for a little bit of time, give us some feedback, tell us about some problems. We might go through, make some updates, and then redeploy that again. The solution framework supports this type of incremental development by making it easy to import new versions and do upgrades as you make changes going forward. So a common cycle might look something like this. You make the changes, you build your applications, your flows, and CDS changes. You export as managed, you install that into test, and ultimately into production. The users give you some feedback. They tell you that there was a small bug. Rather than shipping the whole solution again, you create a patch. A patch contains just one attribute, one component within the solution that you want to fix. You then export that patch and install that patch into test and then into production. Now, you may have 4 or 5 patches that you create before you build the next version. Once you are ready to build the next version, you can roll those patches up into the version 2 of the solution that you're going to make further changes to. And then you repeat this cycle over and over again. That's how solutions help support an incremental building of an application. Now let's go ahead and jump into a quick demo where I'm going to go ahead and create an environment and create a solution that we'll use to track the changes that we build. Okay, I've logged into the Maker portal and I'm looking at my environments. I currently have the default environment and one other one. What I'm going to do is go ahead and create one that I'm going to use for my development work. So I'm going to go to admin.powerapps.com, click New Environment. I'm going to call this Permit Dev, and we're going to go ahead and create this as a production environment in the United States. Once the environment's created, it's going to ask me if I want to have a common data service database in there. I'm going to go ahead and say yes. I'm going to choose United States dollar for the currency, and I'm going to choose English for the language and let it go ahead and create. Now that it's created, I'm going to go back to the Maker portal. I'm going to change my environment to the permit dev. It may take a minute for it to show up for you. Now that I've created my environment, I can go ahead and create a solution. You'll notice that I have a default solution and a common data service default solution. The default solution gives you a good way to show everything, but you really don't want to use it for making any changes. If you go to create data and create an entity, it'll end up in the common data service default solution. Right now, this is an empty solution, but what I want to do, because I'm going to create a permit management application, it's going to have some CDS assets, it's going to have a Canvas app, a model-driven app. I want to go ahead and create a new solution that I want to add this into. Now, once I've clicked create, I'm going to go ahead and give it a name. I'm going to create a publisher. Now the publisher is used to put a prefix on the entity and kind of track things all together that you create. So we're going to call this Contoso. You may already have one created in your environment, but the first time you create it in a new environment, you do have to establish it. So here I'm setting the prefix as well as the option set value prefix. So if we create some option sets, we'll see that number used there. And I'll go ahead and say save and close. We'll go ahead and pick that publisher. We'll give a version number for our solution. We're going to start out at version 1, and we're going to go ahead and create. Now, essentially, we've created a solution that we can track all our customizations, and from within here, you'll notice that right now it doesn't have any components, but I can go create new components. I can create apps, I can create dashboards, entities, flows, reports, and a whole bunch of other stuff. I can also add existing assets. So if I already had some things in there, or if I wanted to maybe use the contact entity, so for example, maybe I'm going to use the contact to represent who's going to request changes, I would just simply add that in. And I could choose it. Maybe I want to modify some of the existing fields. I could go in and select the different fields or relationships or forms. What I would do is I would add in the things that I was going to modify to be able to do that. For right now, I'm not going to go ahead and select anything, but I will go ahead and add that in so we have something in our solution that we can see. So as we go through the rest of this module and we build out the solution, as we do the data modeling, I'll add the entities in. As we do some of the other things like building the applications and building the flows, we'll do all that in the context of that solution. So we'll see this list grow as we work on the rest of our assets throughout the rest of this module. Okay, let's move on and talk about the Common Data Service and implementing a data model for our solution in the Common Data Service. And if you recall, I'm using a permitting application for building. So you want to make a change, you need to get a permit, you need to have inspections, and that's what I'm going to model in this. And if you listen to the overview, you will remember I talked about how CDS is a hybrid database where it essentially abstracts the underlying technology that's implementing. So there's relational, there's document, there's file storage, all under the covers of CDS, and that is abstracted into the concept of entities with fields with relationships between the entities. And that's how you model real-world business problems into the Common Data Service. As part of data modeling, you'll identify the entities, the fields, the relationships that you need to create. As you create those relationships, they can be many to one, one to many, as well as many to many. And so, for example, in my permit application, I've got permit that has inspections. Now, one of the things that you'll see me do when we go into the demo is I'll create that so that if the permit is deleted, the behavior on that relationship will cause all the inspections to go away. And I'll use a parental relationship behavior on there to effectively remove the need for me as an application to automate the delete of the inspections if you delete the permit, because the inspections no longer make sense to stay around if I delete the permit, because they only make sense in the context of that permit. So relationships behavior give you that first level of automation at the data layer for being able to automate how you want to handle things when actions happen across the relationship to a parent record. As many businesses these days work in a global environment, they may encounter the need for dealing with multiple currencies as well as multiple languages in their scenarios. And that's one of the things that Common Data Service has out of the box support for. So when you create a currency field, it actually adds two fields to the entity that you're creating that field on, one that tracks the transactional currency that you did that in, and one that tracks the base currency that the organization is configured for. And this allows you to have records that have their own individual currency selection, as well as track the exchange rate between when the transaction was recorded, giving you that out-of-the-box support for multiple currencies. Same thing with around languages. One of the things that the platform does is track all the metadata for labels and descriptions, and all of those can be exported, and you can translate those into the different languages that you want to support. That allows you to build your applications that have the labels in the native UI language that the user is comfortable interacting with. One of the things that's easily overlooked is some of the automatic assets that get created when you create an entity in CDS. And I'll contrast this to, for example, if you go create a SQL database and you create a table in there, you really don't get as much of a robust application set of assets that you'd get with the Common Data Service. And that's the value that that abstraction layer provides on top of the underlying technologies that is abstracted by the concept of a CDS entity. So in this example, when I create my new entity building, I get several things in here: security model, forms, views, automation, developer API. Let's start with security model. So effectively, one of the things you have to often build for an application is the security model. And CDS implements a role-based security model. This has the concept of a security role. A user can have one or more security roles that combine together to give that user their entitlements to what they can do with the data. You can also define the entity ownership. So records in CDS My Building can either be organization owned, where you have either everybody has access to it or they don't, or it can get more granular down to where users can be assigned as owners or teams can be assigned as owners of the record, and security can follow that model as you're granting access. You also have the ability to get down to the field level security. So if on building, for example, if I had a field that was more sensitive data that I didn't want other users to have access to, I could turn on field level security for that and then grant that to only the users that need to be able to read it or update or modify that data. When you create the entity, a default set of forms and views are created for use in applications. This makes it easy to later then compose applications that leverage those same views and forms. And you can go in and modify these, and these definitions can be role tailored so that individual applications or individual users have access to just what they need and just the fields that they need. And when you define an application, you'll actually compose it from the overall set of forms and views that you've defined associated with that entity. From a process automation standpoint, there's an event pipeline that's built that allows triggering of process automation after records are created, updated, or deleted in the platform. So that means that if I have a flow that I want to run, it can be automatically triggered. I can get down to what specific fields that I want to run. Using developer technologies, as we get into the developer module later on, we'll talk about how there's an event pipeline that developers can hook in before and after that operation happens in the platform. And that is all built in, and you don't have to do anything to set up that plumbing. You just have to register your custom logic or your flows to receive those particular events that have been triggered by the platform. Another common line item on the budget for a typical project built with low-level developer technologies is building an API that abstracts you from the underlying technology. So for example, if we were creating this in SQL, we would write something that would do the calls to SQL, but would provide a layer that we'd actually build our application on. And effectively, that's what you get when you use the connectors through Flow or through a Canvas app. You're talking through the API that the platform creates. And essentially the difference between using this and using the SQL API directly, for example, is the developer API that you get with the Common Data Service implements all the security as well as the business rules that are implemented at the data layer, as well as any process automation, are all respected by the developer API when you make calls to create or read records. That developer API that's created for the entity is what is interact with when you use the Common Data Service connector through Canvas apps or flows. It leverages that API that's built for the entity when you create it, so you don't have to build any additional API logic to be able to do that. Now let's jump into the portal, and in our solution, let's add a few entities so we can see how these all work together and some of the things that we've been talking about. Now I'm back into the solution that we created in the prior demo, and I'm going to go ahead and create our data model, or at least part of it as we watch. I'm going to go ahead and create an entity. Now the first entity I'm going to create is going to be the building entity. And you'll notice I can pick a primary name. I can decide if I want to have notes. You can do some other settings like set the ownership and some of the other things that you can explore on your own time. I'm going to go ahead and create that. Right now I'm going to go ahead and add one other field. This is going to be simply the street. We could add other address fields on it for the location, but I'm going to leave those for you to imagine that they were on there in the essence of time. Go ahead and save the entity. I'm going to go ahead and add another entity. This is going to be my permit entity. And on this one, I'm going to go ahead and enable attachments. This includes notes and files. This will allow us to attach some comments to the permit. So as we maybe interact with the customer, we can go ahead and track some of those notes. Now, because I've turned on notes and it's not able to be turned back off, it's just making sure that I'm okay with that. I'm going to go ahead and add a field. We want to charge for getting the permit. We'll just call this fee. And I'm going to go ahead and look at the different data types here. You'll see there's a whole bunch of different data types, several texts with some formatting, whole numbers. You can do time zone, duration, language, date, time, or just date only. And we're going to use the currency field, and we'll look at some of the other ones as we get a little further along. And we'll go ahead and add that. And we also are going to add another field. Notice we can add multiple fields at once, quickly creating the data model that we have on there. Sometimes we have to waive the fee. So we're going to create a fee waiver, and this is going to be a 2 option field. So kind of a Boolean yes or no. Come down to 2 option. Go ahead and close. We'll actually do a business rule on that in a little bit so that if the fee waiver is there, we won't require the fee to be on. Go ahead and save the entity. And finally, I'm going to add one other entity so that we have enough to kind of build an application with. And this one's going to be the inspection request. And you'll notice in the background, I didn't have to actually hit save there, but my entity had been provisioned successfully, so it kind of did that in the background. Now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and add a relationship on here. So I want to add a relationship from the inspection to the permit that it's related to. So I'm going to go ahead and add a many-to-one relationship, and that is going to be with the permit. So I'm going to scroll down and find the permit and go ahead and add that in, save the entity. And I'm going to do the same thing on the building because it's ultimately the building can have many permits issued against it. So I'm going to create a one-to-many from the building, and we'll associate that with the permit as well. And so essentially we're building up the relationships all around our entity on here. Now, one quick change I want to make just to kind of show you how easy it is to go back and change things on the model. I want to make so that that relationship between inspection and the permit is a parental relationship, so that if we delete the permit, we want to essentially remove the inspections that are related to it. And we left that option as the default. So if I go double click on this again, go into advanced options, we'll see the type of behavior is set to referential. I can change that to parental. And what's going to happen now if I delete a permit, once I've made this change, it will delete all the inspections. So that's how you can automate some of the management of the records across the relationships. Now that we have our basic entities created, I want to go ahead and add a business rule. And the rule I want to do is I want to do this on the permit entity. And I want to basically, if the fee waiver is turned on, I don't want the fee to be required. So I'm going to come over here to business rules. I'm going to go add a business rule. I'm going to go into my condition, and I'm going to say check if fee waived. We're going to check if the fee waiver field is equal to yes. I'm going to click apply, and if it is, then we're going to set business required, set not required, and we're going to set this as not business required, and we're going to set that on the fee field. And then if it is required, We're going to drag this over here, and we're going to say on here, then we're going to say set required. And this is also going to be on the fee field. We're going to make this business required this time. And we're going to go ahead and give our rule a name, set required if not waived. And we'll go ahead and save this rule and activate it. And now at this point, this rule becomes active. So when somebody uses the fields, it becomes a required field if the fee waiver is not set. And we'll see that come to life when we go build a application that uses some of the data. Now you'll notice if I come back over to the portal and look at the solution, we've got a few more things in here. We've got a business rule that's now showing up, set required if not waived. And one last thing I want to be able to do is I want to jump over to the form designer. Now in the form designer, you can add all sorts of things on here. So you can add the different layouts, you can add the sections, the columns. What I'm going to do is I'm going to keep this real simple. I'm just going to go ahead and drag on the building so that we can add the building that this permit is related to. We're going to add the fee, and then I'm also going to add the fee waiver on there. And you notice how quickly I can kind of go ahead and put together this form. Go ahead and publish this. And the final thing I want to do is I want to come back and I want to use one of the other designers. I'm going to go into views. And if I open up my active permits, you'll notice that it's built a default view for us. This is what, when you look at a list of the permits, this is what you're going to see. And so what I want to do is I want to add on to this that we have the building in there and that we have the fee that they paid for that permit. We'll make that a little bit bigger and we'll go ahead and save. And that's how we customize the views. And you can build multiple views. That there's criteria. So down here, I can come in and edit the filters. And this allows me to build all types of criteria. So I could say where the status, where the building created by is in the last 6 months, all kinds of criteria so that your view filters the data the way the users want to see it. So that's a quick look at kind of building a data model and building some of the other assets around it. We also built the forms and the views. And later on, we'll actually build an application that uses some of these assets. In the introduction module, we introduced you to PowerApps as the way that you build applications on the Power Platform. We talked about how if you're doing any Office 365 customizations, you use PowerApps. If you're modifying a Dynamics 365 application, you're modifying a PowerApp. And if you're building a custom application for either your own internal use or as an ISV, PowerApps is the way that you build the applications on the platform. Designer or Canvas Studio, you compose the application and you leverage the connectors to work with data and services. When you start creating a Power App, you're going to make a decision of how you want to start, whether you want to start with a Canvas app or a model-driven app. How you make that decision depends on how you're going to want to control the user experience, as well as the data that you're working with in the application. If you want complete control over the user experience, in other words, you want to start with a blank slate and define what the user experience looks like, then the Canvas apps gives you that complete control over that user experience. If you're going to start with data from the Common Data Service, then a model-driven app gives you a quick way to get an application up and running that has lists of data, forms of data. Essentially, data editing type applications can be really quickly built using the model-driven style. Now, if your data doesn't come from CDS or it comes from CDS and some other data sources, the Canvas apps through the connectors allow you to blend that data together on the design surface. It's important to remember that you're only choosing where to start. You can always combine, for example, a Canvas app inside a model-driven app as one of the components, and we'll talk more about that as we continue through the modules. If I were to generalize the PowerApps app architecture, it would look something like this, where you have an app that's composed of one or more pages, screens that you combine together. And on those pages and screens, you group things together, either through tabs, sections, or groups. And in those groups, you have components. The components could be as simple as a very basic control, like a text input box, or it could be a more complex control that is more of something built by a custom developer, or a Canvas reusable component that could be built using similar constructs that you will build the Canvas apps with. And we'll look at that as we jump in and go through a demo of building the apps. Now, I mentioned that starting from a model-driven application, if you're working with CDS data, can be very beneficial because it's really quick to get an application up and running that has a list of data, forms for editing the data, but it also comes with a number of other features that are just there out of the box without you having to build things. For example, things like personal views. allowing users to define views that they want to have, maybe records created in the last 6 months, records that have been inactive. It also provides controls, things like timeline activity views that allow it to see all the interactions a record has. So for example, if you're tracking appointments, emails, phone calls, all sorts of interactions against a record, the timeline view gives you a very easy way to see what's been happening on that record. From a user productivity point of view, some tools like Excel integration or document templates are built in, allowing you to quickly create Word documents, for example, from some of the data that's in the list, as well as other productivity things for the user like recently viewed, recently pinned. You don't have to go build those into your application. Earlier, I talked about the ability to do localization of the metadata for entities in the fields, changing the labels and having them display in the local language. That all happens automatically. So if you have the language configured on your environment, the user can choose that as their language. So if I wanted French or German, and then the user experience would be adapted to use the labels that you've done the localization on for that language. And if you didn't provide one for the language, it would fall back to the default one for that solution. Now let's actually jump over and build a couple of apps. We're going to build first an application that will be used by the back office team that will manage the permits. This will be a model-driven application that will allow the user to basically input the permit, schedule the inspection, and then we'll build a Canvas app that will be used by the inspectors. These are the people that go out into the field. They'll be using their mobile device, so we'll give them a very tailored application that can just do the inspections. And let's go ahead and take a look at building both of these applications. Now I'm back in the solution. We've got our data model that we created, and I'm now going to go ahead and add an application. I'm going to create a model-driven application for the back office to be able to kind of manage the permit. Call this Permit Manager. And we're going to go ahead and pretty much take the default options here. You could provide your own app image and some other settings that if you want a welcome page, which is kind of a splash screen. But I'm going to go ahead and click Done. I come to the App Designer and I basically see that I don't currently have any entities configured, any dashboards or processes, and my sitemap is asking for me to configure it. The sitemap controls the navigation of the application, and this is where we start composing things. So what I'm going to do is go into that, and I'm going to go ahead and in here, I'm going to change the area to be Permit Management. And the group, call this issue permits. And then in the area, I want to go ahead and start putting some of my entities in. So I'm going to go to Entity. I'm going to go ahead and put this to Permit. And that will cause the permit to be in the navigation. I'm also, just for my own convenience, going to go ahead and add in another sub area. And I could do this from there, or I could come drag it from components, kind of like we did with the business rules. And I'm going to go ahead and on here, I'm going to put a entity in again. Now you'll notice that you can put some other things, the dashboards, web resources. You can even point to a URL. So maybe you have an external site that you want to bring into the app navigation. You can do that as well. And I'm going to bring this in, and this is going to be the buildings. And we'll go ahead and save this. And we'll publish. Now at this point, we've successfully configured the sitemap for our application. And we can go ahead and save and close this and get back to the designer. Now notice what's happened. Because we've added those entities to our navigation, we've now got those referenced by the app. They show up in the list. We can actually work things from here, so we can actually click on these items. This lets you control what forms would be available. You can actually have multiple forms for an entity, multiple views, and from here you can actually deselect and configure specifically for this application what forms, views, charts, dashboards are available to users of that application. We're going to take it, just leave it as all for right now, and I'm going to go ahead and save, and I'm going to go ahead and publish, and I'm going to go ahead and run our application. And that's how quickly it is to build a very basic model-driven application. And so essentially at this point, we've got an ability to do some data entry. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new building. We'll call this Microsoft Headquarters, 1 Redmond Way. Save and close. And then I'm going to go to permits, and I'm going to go create a new permit. This is going to be a room addition. And we're going to pick the building. Now notice, because this is a relationship between the permit and the building, I now have what's referred to as a lookup field. It'll give you kind of a quick shortcut to records you've used recently. You can create new ones from here.
You can search. This would actually launch a search process where you can change the views. You can search for the records. I'm going to go ahead and pick Microsoft headquarters. Now notice that my fee is required, but watch what happens. And that's I can tell that because there's a little red asterisk next to it. Now if I change this to yes, that the fee is waived, notice that it's no longer there. And that's the business rule that we created that is implementing that rule on the fee field, allowing me to make it required or not required. I could also use that to set values and all other types of things on there. So we're going to go ahead and leave that not waived and go ahead and set the fee to $500 and go ahead and save the record. Now you notice over here on the right, that's the timeline control. We had that because we had notes enabled. So establish permit for Bill Gates, and I will pay later. And I could go ahead and add notes. I could attach things to it. I could also add other activities to it. So things like if I wanted to have tasks and phone calls tracked, those could all show up in the timeline so you could see all the interactions that happen there. You can also go to related, and this is where you're going to see other related records to this entity. So I have inspections. So if we had some inspections, we could see what those inspections. And that's how quickly you can build a basic model-driven application. Now let's go ahead and switch gears and look at building our Canvas application for our inspectors that are going to go out into the field and do the inspection of that room addition once it's ready for inspection. Now I'm back in our solution and notice that we've got our permit manager showing up in here, our model-driven app, and also a client extension. That's our sitemap for the navigation. And now what I'm going to do is go ahead and create our inspector application. So I'm going to go ahead and create an app. This time I'm going to choose Canvas. I'm going to use the phone form factor because they're going to use it on their mobile app device. And once the studio starts, you find ourselves in the application with kind of a blank slate that we can do whatever we want. Now notice we don't have any application navigation or anything. That's all up to us to build. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and connect to one of our data sources. So I'm going to go to View, Data Sources, and I'm going to go ahead and add a data source. This is where you can get all kinds of different data from SharePoint to Adobe Creative Cloud, to Adobe Sign, any data or service that is available as a connector you can do from here. So I'm going to use the Common Data Service. So I'm going to say Common Data Service, and I'm going to go ahead and choose that, and I'm going to create. And it's going to have me choose the entity I want to work with. Now I want to work with inspections right now. So I'm going to go ahead and choose inspections. And now that's associated with my application. Now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and give a quick list of inspections that this inspector has available to them. So I'm going to come in and I'm going to do an insert of a gallery. I'm going to make this a vertical gallery. We'll leave this blank for right now because I'm going to go ahead and customize the format of it. Now I'm going to go ahead and add into this gallery a label that will be the name of the inspection. So we haven't connected this to any items yet. Right now it's just set to this customer default gallery. So notice what's happening up here is I've clicked on this gallery control that I've added. It has different properties that you can work with. This is the items property that says what data is connected to it. I'm going to change that to be inspections. Now notice what happens when I start typing. I get the IntelliSense hints that makes it easy for me to find the data that I want to connect to. And you'll notice that I've now got this populated with some data. It's pulled in the created on date. But what I really want to have is I want to have that be the name of the inspection, which will tell me a little bit about what type of inspection I'm doing on there. Now, you'll notice that I get real time as I make these changes. I'm able to see this happen on here, and I'm able to kind of real time make adjustments and see the results of that. And in fact, I'm going to go ahead and add the street address of the building. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to add another label. And in this second field, what I want to do is I know this is related to the permit. So I'm going to be able to just simply say .permit. And that uses the relationship, and that gives me access to all the fields on the permit. And so I want to just show the name of the permit that I'm putting on there. And that way we can see that it's a room addition, it's add a restroom. And now if I want to size this up a little bit more, you'll notice I can kind of pull these up And if I wanted each item to be a little smaller, I could go ahead and do that. Now there's all kinds of things that you can do on here. So we could have forms. So like if I needed to add an inspection, I might have them use a edit form to go ahead and fill out the results of the inspection and update some fields on it. I could do a display form, which is more of a read only. You've got media controls. So let's actually go ahead and just add some navigation on here. Let's first of all, we've got our first screen, and you'll notice from here I can do all kinds of things, like I can rename this and call this main screen. And I can go ahead and if I want, I can add a new screen. And this gives you some ideas of layouts. Do you want it scrollable? Do you want it to be a list? I'm just going to go ahead and choose blank. And then I'm going to call this the inspection. And on here, what I'm going to do is I want to actually, maybe they want to actually go use one of the media controls. So I could have them upload an image. I could use some of the device things like scan barcodes. I could also use the camera. Now what we're going to do is go ahead on here, and just for simplicity, we're going to use the display form. We'll display some information about the selected permit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and set the data source on this display form to the inspections. And I'm going to go ahead and set the item. Now notice how I'm working with these properties to kind of bind them to the other controls. So I'm going to say this is gallery1.selected. That's the item that we have selected in the other control. And I'm going to go ahead and edit the fields. Now what I'm doing here is I'm essentially taking from the fields that are available. So I'm going to go ahead and bring on the created on field, the name field. We'll just keep it as a couple of those, maybe modified on, just so we can see if it's been changed. And we'll go ahead and drop those on. And this gives us a display only view. You can actually set some of the properties. Depending on the field type, you can choose how it's going to display. Now what I want to do is go ahead and set up some navigation. So we're going to, just so we can do this, I'm going to drag this down a little bit. I'm going to go add an icon, and we're going to add a back button. And we're not trying for the prettiest thing on here. Now, notice the onSelect, that's a behavior property. This lets me do a formula. Formulas are how you cause things to happen. So I wanted to do a navigate back to that prior page. I could use the navigate and specify the actual page, but what I'm going to do is simply use the back function to tell it to go back to whatever navigated to it. Now to get to this page, I'm going to go back to the main screen. I'm going to edit the control that we have on here, this item, and I'm going to go ahead and add an item icon on here so we can use it to drill down. Go ahead and click that. We'll drag that over. And on this one, on the select, we're going to navigate to our inspection screen. And now we can actually run our applications. And so far we've been just kind of previewing it. And I could hold down the Alt key and it would let me kind of do the navigation from without launching the application. But what I could also do is quickly jump into the player by hitting the play up here and run the application. And you can see the list of inspections. I can go ahead and go back and forth between it. So we can see how you can very easily kind of craft and compose your own application. But it's very different from what we saw with the model-driven application, where we just basically said what entities we want to navigate and everything was kind of built. Everything we want to have in the Canvas app gives us a lot of control. It's a blank slate, but we have to build that out. So, things like we might want to have a little bit of a header control. So what I might do is I might come down here and I might want to have a header control on here. So I might bring this up here, make this a little bit prettier. And you can do all kinds of things to kind of make this personalized so that and we can say this is an inspector app. This is our name. And we could even go and do some formatting of that. So we could choose the color, maybe want it to be white. And all of this is done visually through the application. And you can see how you can kind of incrementally build this as you work through things. Now, one other thing I wanted to call out, you'll notice if I come in here on this and I actually change this permit name to Dave, you'll notice I get the little arrow up here, but also on the right-hand side, this app checker, the little stethoscope up here, it's kind of highlighting that I've got a problem in one of my formulas, and it tells me where that is. And if I click on it, it will take me to there. That's a quick way to kind of know how to resolve errors and if you have any problems. So app checker is kind of there to give you that real-time IntelliSense of what's going on. And that's a quick look at building both a model-driven app and a Canvas app.
Now that you've seen a couple of apps built using each of the styles, model-driven and canvas, I wanted to come back and give you a little insight into the roadmap of where things are headed. Now, obviously, the end goal is to not have necessarily some of the two different ways that you build applications. As much as the applications are productive and that you build them today, you're going to see over time, over the next 12 to 18 months, them come together into a single app designer where you'll be able to mix and match the application types even more seamlessly than you can do today using some of the embedded capabilities of putting Canvas inside Model. Now, the first part of that journey is introducing responsive custom pages to the Canvas applications. And so that will be coming as a first enhancement. It will allow you to have a page that not only will be responsive as you size it, but it will have the ability to have groupings so you can put the components and lay it out. Very similar to what you might think of when we laid out the model-driven app form and we had the concept of tabs and sections. By introducing that Canvas page, that will be available for Canvas apps initially to use, so you could just add that as another asset to your application. Not long after that, you'll be able to add that Canvas page also to a model-driven app, giving you an additional way to leverage Canvas inside a model-driven app. The final step in the convergence of the application types is being able to use a single studio and a single user experience for running the applications. And when you're in the studio, you choose the type of page, form, or view, or dashboard that you want to add to the navigation of the app, and the components can be shared between the different types of pages, whether it's forms, views, without having regard to what type of application it is, whether it's model-driven or Canvas. And the most important thing to understand about the convergence of the app types is as you make applications today, they will not be impacted by the conversion. And the only thing that will happen as you get down the road and you're able to have the apps that are combined is you'll be able to do more with the application all within a single studio without leaving to go to different designers. Let's move on from applications to talk about Microsoft Flow. In the overview module, we talked about what a flow looks like. We talked about how a flow has a trigger that causes the flow to start execution, and then it has one or more actions that provide the actual logic that you want to have happen when the flow runs. Now, as you start to build your flow, the first thing you're going to do is configure the trigger that you're going to use to start the flow. There are different types of triggers that you can use to trigger the flow, and they have different characteristics. The first are instant flows. Instant flows are ones that trigger when the user takes some action. An example of those is the flow button in the mobile application. So when the user clicks it, the flow runs instantly right after that. From Excel, you can have it on a selected row in the Excel, passing the context of that, or from Common Data Service. So from a model-driven application, maybe I'm on the permit row and I want to run a particular flow against that permit that was issued or against the building. I can have the trigger be when a record is selected, and that would cause it to show in the list in the user experience and allow the user to click it. Now, with each of the instant flows, you can pass some parameters to them. So on the permit, maybe I want to apply a fee because it was late or the inspection failed and they have to do a re-inspection. So I could run a flow, and as part of running that flow, I could be prompted for the $50 extra charge for the additional trip charge for doing the secondary inspection. The next type of flow is a scheduled flow. Scheduled flows allow you to run them on a reoccurring basis. So you might say that I want it to start today at 10 a.m. and I want it to repeat every minute, every hour, once a week. These are perfect for things that you need to run on a reoccurring basis. The next type is the PowerApps trigger. This allows you to, from a Canvas application, have a button or other action control on there that triggers a flow to run. Take a scenario where we have an inspector that's out in the field. They're getting ready to go to their next location for inspection, and they want to advise the people that they're on their way if the customer had asked for a 15-minute notification before they arrive. So literally by just simply clicking on a button, that could cause it to invoke a flow. That flow could then do the check on the record to see if the customer requested a notification. If it did request a notification and has a cell phone number, it could use one of the SMS connectors to send an SMS saying that the inspector is 15 minutes out. And all that could happen in the background just by the inspector pushing the button in the PowerApps Canvas app. The final category of trigger types is automated flows. Examples of these are things like new file is added to a Dropbox folder, new item is added to a SharePoint list, or the Common Data Service where a new record is created, updated, or deleted, And you can even get down on, for example, on the common data service ones, you can provide scoping as well as filtering attributes. So maybe I only want to know when the contact's first name and last name have changed. Any other change to that contact, I don't want to run the flow. To build the flows, you'll use the Flow Designer, which is a visual designer. You'll simply search for the trigger that you want to use. You'll configure any options. You'll then add the additional steps. And we've got an example of one here that's a little bit more robust than the one I showed you at the beginning of the section. On this one, we're triggering based on a new email that's arrived in the email box of the user. They're using the get my profile action to find out who their information is. So that would return David Yak and my email address. But what I'm really interested in is my manager here. So it's doing a get on my manager. That allows us to get the email from the manager and allows us to do a condition check to say, is the new email that arrived from my manager? And if it is, then post it to a Slack channel with that particular information to highlight it. So this is just a simple self-productivity example. We'll go and build another flow when we get into the demo on this. But from building this, you could also use some of the tools like Flow Checker. Flow Checker allows you to highlight if there's any errors. It'll highlight what errors exist, similar to App Checker was for the PowerApps Canvas apps. It also has built-in testing to allow you to test the flow, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Both the built-in checker and the testing capabilities are designed to make it easier to build flows and resolve problems that you might run into. This highlights what Flow Checker looks like, so you can see that I've got 3 errors that I need to resolve. One of them needs an entity name specified, and the other needs the file name and the file content. So I can click on those. It'll take me right to where I need to in the flow. As your flows get a little bit more complex, that helps you find the things that you need to fix a lot quicker. The testing capability helps a lot when you incrementally build a flow. It allows you to, along the way as you're building it out, to test it periodically to see the results and then go make the additional changes and do it again. Now, what you have the ability to do with the testing is when you click on test the flow, the first time you have to perform the trigger action. So if it was when a record is selected, you go to the application, you'd run it against a record, and then it would run your flow interactively. You'd see it go through the steps and you'd be able to see the outcomes from each of the steps. You'd be able to click edit, make any changes. Now, after that first time, you would then be able to use data from a previous run because you've already run it once. And it would allow you to pick from the last few recently runs of that flow. You pick the record, you save and test, and it's going to rerun it again. And you can kind of repeat that process going through the test, edit, until you get the results that you're looking for. Let's go ahead and jump into the Flow Designer and build a flow. Okay, we're back in our solution, and what I want to do is go ahead and create a flow that runs when a new inspection is created and sends an email to the inspector to let them know they've been assigned an inspection. So what I'm going to do is come in here and do a new flow that will launch the Flow Designer. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to be prompted to select a trigger. So I'm going to use the search and I'm going to look for the common data service. And I'm going to choose the current environment one because I'm building in a solution that selects the environment that I'm currently in. And I'm going to select the when a record is created, updated, or deleted. And we're going to configure that to run when a record is created. You'll notice though that you can choose to have combinations of these if it makes sense, but we're going to go ahead and stick with that. We want to run this when the inspections are created. And we want to run on any records that are created regardless of who the owner is, so we're going to show that on there. Some of the controls have additional options. You always want to kind of take a look to see what you have. And now that we've triggered, that tells us we have a new record. What I want to do is I want to get the user information associated with that. So I'm going to go ahead and do a new step. And this time I'm going to do a common data service again because I'm going to retrieve the user record that is the owner of that inspection. And you'll notice that when I click on this, there are several different actions I can now take. I can create a record, I can delete a record, get a record, list, update. And you can also use the AI builder to run one of the predictions off one of your AI builder models. But what we're going to do is we're going to do a get record and we're going to have it look up the user record. So we're going to pick users. Now I need to pick an item identifier. This is the ID of the record. So I'm going to click on this. You notice what happens when I click in the field that it shows this dynamic content panel over here. This allows me to see data from the prior steps. And what I want to do is I basically want to go down and I want to take owner
and I want to take the value of that owner ID, and I'm going to use that to look up the record. And I'm going to go ahead and change the name of this. So you'll notice on each of these cards, if you click on the dot, 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 you can get settings, you can rename them. And I'm going to call this get user. And that's kind of important because it allows you to easily reference things and know what it is when you're referencing later on. And to keep this simple, I'm going to go ahead and send an email. We're going to use the Office 365 connector. So notice now we're using another connector as part of this. So we're going to go ahead and send an email, and we're going to specify who it's going to. And we're going to do that by using the email from the other user. We're going to use the primary email. And notice that this get user shows up, so it makes it easy to find that on there. And we're going to say that you've signed new inspection. And just for simplicity's sakes, in the body of the email, we're going to go down and bind that to some data from the first when a record is created. We're going to bind that to the name field of the inspection that they were assigned. Now at this point, we could actually drag things around and move things around. We want to give this an actual name, so we'll call this Notify Inspector, and we'll go ahead and save our flow. Now that we've created our flow, what we want to do is run a quick test on it. Notice that just like App Checker, there's also Flow Checker. I don't have any errors. If I had some, that would show up here and I could resolve them. Just like we did in the Canvas app with the App Checker, we can resolve them there. I'm going to go ahead and click Test. Now you get two options. Remember we talked about this. I'm going to do the perform the action, and we'll hit the test. Now, at this point, my flow is sitting here waiting for me to create a record. So I'm going to come over to my model-driven application, and I'm going to go ahead and add an inspection record. See if done yet. We'll go ahead and save and close, and I'll come back over to my flow. And as it picks up that record, we'll see that start processing. And once a flow is processed, you can look at the results of it. So you can click on each of the items. You can see what some of the values are, what the data that was returned. You can see that it sent the email okay. And that's an example of being able to do that. So if we came back to our solution now and click done on this, you'll notice that we now have a complete solution. So we have our entities, we have our model-driven app, we have our Canvas app, we have our business rule that we created. We also have our Notify Inspector application flow showing up on there. All these are combined in one solution. Now, if we wanted to move this to test, we would simply come over here, do an export, and we would basically export it as managed, and that would give us a file that we would then import into that other environment. If you came here from more of an Azure background, you might be looking at Microsoft Flow and saying, wow, that looks really a lot like Azure Logic Apps. That's no coincidence. Microsoft Flow is built on top of the Logic Apps engine, and the majority of the connectors and capabilities are the same. There is a difference, however, in how you pay for execution of a Logic App versus a Flow. Logic App runs on a trigger action consumption model. In other words, in the context of an Azure subscription, and for each trigger and each action that runs, you're paying incrementally for each of those. Whereas Microsoft Flow is based on the total run. So if the flow runs 5 times, that is decremented from your allowance that you get for a Power Platform license. There are a couple other areas that you should be aware of differences between Flow and Logic Apps. One of them is around the deeper integration that Flow has with the Common Data Service, including ability to package a flow with solutions to make deployments easier, whereas the Logic Apps is deployed using the ARM templates. Azure Logic Apps have access to enterprise integration features like B2B EDI that is also not available in Microsoft Flow. Nothing says that you can't use both Flow and Logic Apps as it's appropriate for your particular solution, but Microsoft Flow has a lot of characteristics that make it very desirable to use if you're building other Power Platform assets. As I went through this module, you saw how I use solutions to track the customizations that I built. Each time we build an additional asset, we did that from the context of the solution that we were working with. That was done in our development environment. We could define test and production environments that we could deploy that solution to. The next step in formalizing and making a little bit more robust application lifecycle management process out of it would be to leverage something like Azure DevOps to be able to do some of the actual tracking of the solution changes that you make. So we could use the Git repository that was part of Azure DevOps to store the changes. That would allow tracking the individual changes and allow teams to have a little bit more velocity of the changes that they make without conflicting with each other.
We could then use the CI/CD, the continuous integration, continuous deployment processes that we could build, the pipelines, to basically automate the process of exporting the solution from source control, building the managed solution, and then using the release pipelines and approvals if we want to deploy that to our test and production environments once it got approval from testing. By leveraging Azure DevOps, we would have a more repeatable process for managing our application that we built. That brings us to the end of Module 2, where we looked at tailoring the Power Platform for our specific project requirements. I wanted to leave you with some additional learning resources, as well as some customer stories to get you excited about things that you might want to do in your own organization. I hope all of you join us in the third module, where we look at diving deeper into some of the techniques developers can use to unblock the more complex requirements.